Hi, and welcome to LawSplained Simply, a channel designed for you to educate you and to empower you when making litigation decisions. My name is Ruzbo Hosseini, and I am a partner at Cambridge LLP, a law firm in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, that on a day-to-day basis helps its clients with their litigation needs. In the last episode, we discussed the different procedural routes that you may take in litigation, and we briefly touched upon the cost consequences of maybe taking the wrong procedural route. But that was a very brief discussion. And what I wanted to do today was sort of dive deeper into the cost consequences of litigation, because the cost consequences of litigation is a very important factor when determining whether to commence litigation, and when commencing litigation, what steps to take. So let's get to it. So the cost consequences of litigation are important because Ontario has a loser pays system. And what that means is that a losing party typically has to compensate the successful party on a portion of the successful party's litigation costs. And the purpose of this is threefold. First, to compensate the successful party for their part of the litigation expenses, to encourage settlement and deter frivolous litigation, and also to promote the efficient use of court resources. And there are really three types of cost awards that a court may order. The first is called partial indemnity costs. And this is the most typical type of cost order that is made by an Ontario court. And it usually represents between 40 and 60% of the actual legal fees incurred by the successful litigant. Now, notice that I said legal fees and not all of the costs. And that's because typically your legal costs are composed of two separate areas. One is your legal fees, and one is your disbursements, like court filing costs, process server fees, photocopy expenses, and the like. You're typically entitled to 100% of your reasonable out-of-pocket expenses, like your court filing fees and things like that. Okay, so when we're talking about legal costs, in this particular episode, we're really talking about legal fees. So the fees that your lawyer charges you or your paralegal. Okay. So partial indemnity costs, you're typically entitled between 40 and 60%. But a court may also, in certain circumstances, order what's called substantial indemnity costs. And those are costs that represent between 80 and 90% of the actual legal fees incurred. So it's a higher scale of costs in comparison to partial indemnity costs. But it's awarded much less frequently, and usually in cases where there's some sort of bad behavior or misconduct on the part of the unsuccessful party. You know, typically that could be bad faith or an abusive process of some sort. But also, substantial indemnity costs may be ordered in circumstances where the successful party makes an offer to settle that the successful party meets or beats at the time that the order is made. And so we'll talk about that briefly in the next slides. The third type of cost award that may be made is full indemnity, which means 100% of your legal fees. But this is very, very rare and is typically only awarded in very exceptional cases where there is egregious, outrageous, or abusive conduct of some kind. When the court determines what scale of costs and what costs are reasonable to order in a circumstance, the court will look at various factors. Okay, and those factors are the result of the proceeding. So what was the result? What did you seek and what did you get? Did you make an offer to settle? You see that comes up again, and we'll deal with that in the next slide. The complexity of the proceeding. Okay, how difficult was the proceeding in comparison to the legal fees that you spent? The importance of the issues between the parties. The conduct of one or more parties in that particular proceeding. The time spent and the rates charged in those steps that were taken, and whether the time that was spent was reasonable in relation to what you were achieving. And finally, any other matter that the court deems as relevant and reasonable on the issue of costs. So let's talk about offers to settle, because this is important. Offers to settle are a very important step in litigation in Ontario because it affects the cost consequences of a legal proceeding. An offer to settle encourages parties to settle by imposing financial risk for an unreasonable refusal to accept an offer. Okay? So for example, if a plaintiff makes an offer to a defendant that the defendant rejects or does not accept, and the plaintiff later obtains an order or a judgment that is as favorable or more favorable than the offer, then the plaintiff will be entitled to partial indemnity costs up until the day they made that offer, and then substantial indemnity costs from the date of the offer to the date that the order was made. Okay, so let's give an example. Okay, perfect example is, or an easy example is, the plaintiff brings a action for the enforcement of a $100 debt. Okay, and at the commencement of the proceeding, the plaintiff makes an offer to settle for $90. So the plaintiff's making a compromise. He's saying, I'm entitled to $100, but I will accept $90 if you pay me today. And the defendant refuses. And the plaintiff goes through the process of litigation and is successful and gets an order for payment by the defendant for $100 or even $91. Okay? At that point, the plaintiff will be entitled to ask the court for a higher scale of costs, okay, which is the 80 to 90% of their legal fees versus the 40 to 60. And of course, the same principle applies to defendants. So a defendant can also make an offer to settle. So in our example of that $100 debt, okay, if the defendant makes an offer and says, well, you plaintiff, you say you're entitled to $100, but I think you're only entitled to $90. And the defendant makes that offer. And the plaintiff later obtains judgment and only gets $89. Okay, well, the defendant had offered more money initially or prior to the judgment being rendered. And so the defendant will then be entitled to substantial indemnity costs, which is 80 to 90% of their legal fees incurred from the time that offer is made. So it's really important in litigation to make a reasonable offer as quickly or as soon as possible, because you want to be able to capture as much of your legal fees as possible in the event that you're successful. Thank you very much for joining us on this 4th episode of LawSplained Simply. Don't forget to like and subscribe and come back and join us, because we'll be talking about other issues in litigation that may interest you. So I look forward to seeing you again. Bye-bye.